Thank you so much for joining us for this second panel. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to Dan for organizing. Thank you so much for the RUSI events team for supporting this conference. And of course, thank you to all the panelists who are joining us here today, despite any train problems that they might have encountered on the way here. Glad to see a full panel. I'm Dr. Pia Hüsch. I'm a research fellow within RUSI's cyber team. I work on cyber policy. I've done a lot of research on ransomware and critical national infrastructure, but I am not an energy expert, so this is going to be a little bit of a merger of the two areas, cybersecurity and the energy sector. I will chair this panel on this important topic, which unfortunately continues to be ever so timely in light of increasing cyber threats faced by critical national infrastructure, including the energy sector, here in the UK, but also globally. I'm happy to be supported by this esteemed panel, bringing together cyber and energy expertise. We will discuss the topic for roughly 45 minutes, an hour. We actually have a fairly large section today with an hour and a half, but we'll make sure that there's plenty of time for Q&A from the audience. So please prepare your best questions. We'll get to them. This panel and the subsequent Q&A are both on the record, so please bear that in mind. Could I now please ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and perhaps you could include whether you are Team Cyber or Team Energy, or whether you have indeed done the impossible and you have actually expertise in both. Could we start to my left, Jess, please?
Hi, good morning. Very nice to see so many good folks here. My name is Singh, and I'm a senior principal at DNV. I started life in the North Sea in the good old oil and gas, working on offshore platforms, drill ships, things like that. And then a few years ago, moved into sustainable energy to pay for my sins. And I look after sustainable transport, and cyber resilience, infrastructure, electrification aspects, projects globally, obviously working with my good folks at DNV. Right.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me today. My name is Matthew Cowlard. I'm head of the cyber policy team at Ofgem. My background is very much on the cyber and security side of things. I've been at Ofgem for the past 3 years, so I've got a good sense of the energy sector by now, hopefully. And before that, I've worked for the National Cybersecurity Centre and a range of other kind of national security jobs across government. Ofgem plays a key role in the energy sector when it comes to cyber. We are the joint competent authority under the existing legislation for cybersecurity, along with our colleagues at the Department for Energy. And we've got a kind of real focus and duty when it comes to protecting energy consumers in Great Britain.
So, good morning, everyone. My name is Emil Lupu. I am a professor of computer systems at Imperial College London, and I'm also a co-director of the NCSE-sponsored Institute in Trustworthy Interconnected Cyber-Physical Systems. My background is very much in sort of computer science and cybersecurity, so definitely on the sort of team cyber rather than on energy and power systems. My research focuses very much on understanding, what is the sort of technological evolutions of systems, what are the difficult problems, and how we can develop new techniques in order to ensure that systems are both more robust and more resilient to essentially cybersecurity attacks.
Hi everyone, my name is Kyna. It's great to be here. I am assistant head of the cyber policy team in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And my part of the team is really responsible for understanding and mitigating the threats and risks we see to the energy system, and that includes both electricity and gas, but also downstream oil and other key sectors as well. To do that, we work really closely with our colleagues at the National Cyber Security Centre and Ofgem, as well as our industry stakeholders to really kind of build that resilience across the sector and help them kind of pivot to the new and changing threat as we transition to net zero. So I'm very much, I come from a policy level. I've worked in energy and security for about 6 years now. So I have a relatively good understanding of both cyber and energy, but I'll leave the really technical stuff to Emil. Hand you the tricky questions.
Excellent. We're very grateful to have both Team Cyber and Team Energy, and a combination of the two represented on our panel today. Let's start to identify a little bit what we're talking about and what we're dealing with when we're talking about cybersecurity, but also cyber threats in the energy sector. Is it indeed that sort of colonial pipeline ransomware threat that we're looking at that keeps you all busy? Or are we looking at something completely different, hacktivists? What are the cyber threats that you're facing or that the energy sector is facing? Perhaps we could start with Jazz to my left.
Thanks, Pia. Thing that I'll start with is that I don't like to use word cybersecurity. I tend to use cyber resilience.
I think you're going to have a hard time on this panel.
Security to me sounds like, sort of locking up and hunkering down. Resilience is getting up and doing business. And I think in the coming years, we should be talking about resilience. Anyway, ransomware, that's an interesting one. If we look at the data, actually, last few years, we've seen a decline in ransomware attacks. But they are becoming a lot more targeted. It's harder to recover from them. And so whether they keep me awake at night within the sector, honestly, not at the moment. I think they're few and far in between. We still need to worry about them. And I'm not saying that we can be complacent about that, but there are other things that do worry me. And this is purely from experience. We're living in an age of hyperconnectivity. So we're connecting old systems, old operational technology, things that were never really designed with security in mind to the big wide world. And that introduces enormous issues. Our attack surface, which is where people can come in, is massive now. So that does keeps me awake, and it's very hard. And the other thing that worries me is how intricate our supply chain is getting. And we're not really looking after the threat coming from the supply chain.
We will deal with the supply chain in just a minute, but perhaps I can quickly turn to Kyna. Do you share that assessment on ransomware, or what do you think it is that the energy sector is facing primarily?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say that ransomware is still a huge threat to RCNI. I think the way that it's changing is not necessarily that we're seeing more attacks, it's that we're seeing different methods. So it kind of links to what you were saying, Jazz. I think the supply chain is now becoming a more attractive target for ransomware actors because it is seen as the kind of soft underbelly to RCNI systems. But I think in general, when we're talking about threats here, the war in Ukraine has really changed how we view that. And I think since last year, where we did a joint announcement with some allies, including the US, I think what we're seeing now is more state-aligned groups who are ideologically rather than financially motivated. And what concerns us about these groups is that, generally speaking, they are less constrained because they're not acting in the state apparatus, they're acting on behalf of the state. They're generally sympathetic to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They have broader targeting, and they're generally just less predictable. So we can take all that alongside the motivation to kind of disrupt and be destructive in our critical infrastructure. There was actually an advisory that the National Cyber Security Centre published on the 5th of September, also about the activities of the GRU in tracking critical national infrastructure in foreign states, and that was targeted at those states who are aiming to give aid to Ukraine. So I think we're definitely seeing more kind of destructive action there. I think we also need to talk about China as part of that picture. So we are seeing increasing sophistication there. You may have heard of Typhoon earlier in May this year. But this was essentially public disclosure of Chinese actors who had been using certain techniques to basically live within critical infrastructure systems in the US. And that shows, again, this motivation to prepare and pre-position future attacks, which is a real step change in how we view the threat from China in particular. And I think when you build all of that on the context of energy transition, of growing complexity, of basically more surface area for attack, that is what is concerning to us. And in particular in the energy system, when you have lots of legacy infrastructure, lots of operational technology, that then becomes much more complex.
Great points there, particularly on that geopolitical context that I think we'll come back to in just a minute. But before we turn to that, Matthew, can I just ask, do you agree with this assessment of threats? Is that what keeps you up at night? What is sort of the worst case scenario that you're preparing for?
Thanks. So, yeah, I think colleagues on the panel have kind of articulated some really key points. I think from a regulatory perspective, if you take a step back and look at the global picture, you can see the range of threats that is affecting, companies around the world. So we've got that kind of global baseline where threat actors will go after the kind of lowest hanging fruit. And there are a range of different threat actors, as we've alluded to. There's everything from the kind of most highly sophisticated state threats down to the kind of lower level kind of activists or hacktivists, if you will, who want to target the energy sector because A, it's high profile, it's quite a sexy target because you're going to get a real world impact. So we've got to be kind of conscious of the range of different threats that are out there. Ofgem works really closely with industry to kind of understand how industry is facing this. We work really closely with government and the National Cybersecurity Centre to make sure that we understand the threats so that we can help support industry. And one of the ways that we do that is around kind of getting the fundamentals right. Cybersecurity, cyber resilience across, large energy organizations and the breadth of those estates and the kind of often international links that they have. So it's a really challenging thing. But trying to get those fundamental rights is critical. And in terms of, thinking about incidents, I think any incident in the energy sector has got the real potential to be significant. And certainly when it comes to Ofgem and Ofgem's role of thinking about consumers, any impact to the security of supply is significant to those end users. So that's why we're taking kind of such a proactive approach, working with industry to try and kind of reduce those risks.
Sorry, can I push you slightly on that sort of worst case scenario that you're prepping for?
Again, I'm going to go with any incident.
Any incident is a worst case. Okay. I work on the assumption that most members of the audience are team energy and not team cyber, and I work in cybersecurity policy, and I don't have a technical background either. But we do have one representative of team cyber on the panel, so I would like to take this opportunity and ask Emil and put him a little bit on the spot to unpack a little bit further what we mean by these threats in a little bit more of a technical sense. I mean, I promise we're not going to go too hardcore on the technical side, but perhaps, RUSI's mission is the education of the policy discourse, so perhaps we can unfold that a little bit. How do you think these threats play out in the energy sector, and how do they relate to other trends in the energy sector like decentralization and increased complexity?
Well, I think that sort of, and this will continue the sort of the points that have been made by my colleagues on the panel. I think that the sort of current trends that we see will very much go in the same direction. We see increasingly sort of more devices and more subsystems connected to the energy infrastructure, whether these are, electric vehicle charging points, or whether they are energy storage systems, or whether there is a sort of more decentralized production of energy, microgrids, and so on. These are increasingly managed by a sort of a broader spectrum of organizations, and this has consequences in terms of the sort of information that is shared across these different organizations. So these factors have a sort of a number of I would say, significant security implications. Yeah, many of these sort of devices are probably going to be easier to compromise, and therefore this sort of creates two effects. On one side, they can be used as an entry point in a sort of hyper-connected system, and therefore from then an attack could spread across the various connections to the other parts of the system. On the other hand, it becomes possible to sort of compromise a larger number of these sort of smaller systems, and then to be able to make them act in concert in order to be able to create effects that have much larger impact. So, sort of think about sort of simultaneous disruptions appearing in different parts of the system, and those disruptions sort of being coordinated in such a way that they have an aggregated effect. And I think that sort of attacks upon a system are not going to manifest simply as sort of bringing down a small part of the system, but may manifest in different ways. So, for example, you can sort of switch systems on and off, for example, to try to affect the stability of the energy system. You can make them sort of send commands that they are not meant to. You can try to sort of withhold the propagation of commands across the system when they are necessary. You can make them lie about the sort of information that is monitored and acquired of the system. So considering the way in which a sort of a compromised device may behave under the control of an attacker is significantly more than just considering that the device will sort of fail. And if the sort of systems are managed by different organizations, detecting sort of such attacks is also going to be a lot more difficult. And in order to be able to be resilient to this type of attacks, we need sort of fairly sophisticated techniques and fairly sophisticated tools in order to be able to sort of manage or understand the complexity of how effects are going to propagate across the system. So
I'd actually like to follow up a little bit on that, and mindful perhaps, Josh, I've seen you nod already. Perhaps you want to come in on this as well. You mentioned sort of the possibility for simultaneous attacks on several devices and the threat or the potential of coordinated attacks, which of course need a significant amount of sophistication from the attacker side. Is that something that we're realistically seeing already, or is that something that you're expecting over the next few years?
I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, 5,500 wind turbines in Germany went down via SAT attack. So we have already seen that. If we look at our energy infrastructure, and especially the future grid concept, where We have a lot of micro generation that's going to be connected, so that's your solar plants and battery storage units, along with your bulky fossil fuel run systems. When you penetrate the grid now, it's not that you're going to attack a single machine or a single turbine somewhere. You're going to try and destabilize the whole thing. So, if I pick a supplier, Mr. Wind Turbine B Limited, I will attack their data center. I will then go everywhere. So it's all about, as Kyna was saying, the selection and the potential impact is now very carefully calculated by the threat actors. And there's a lot of money involved. So more often than not, they are typically state-sponsored.
And you just mentioned state-sponsored attacks. You mentioned Viasat, and then, Kyna, of course, you already mentioned the geopolitical context. Could we come back to that a little bit further? We hear about Russia, we hear about China and other adversaries of the UK when it comes to cyber threats that the UK faces, particularly, for example, in the healthcare sector as well, but also when it comes to other critical national infrastructure. And how far do you experience this geopolitical competition in your everyday work when it comes to the energy sector?
Yeah, I mean, we've covered this a little already in terms of the most sophisticated threat actors, but I think it is them that we really need to be concerned about, because they are the ones who have both the motivation and the capability to conduct the kind of attacks that we were just speaking about. As Matthew said earlier, it's the National Cyber Security Centre who do a lot of work to kind of map and understand how that threat is changing. But I think what actually is the big challenge is being able to translate the intelligence that we have into something that's useful and actionable for industry, because it's really them on the front line of this stuff. So that is where it becomes really useful to work with international partners like the US and other Five Eyes nations to try and do our best to declassify intelligence where we can, or to provide kind of targeted, actionable advice for companies when we are seeing the geopolitical landscape changing and the different threats that are on our networks. Because I think it's a bit of a cliche, but the threat actor only needs to get it right once, whereas our industry and the people protecting our critical infrastructure have to get it right all the time. So it's a huge challenge, and anything we can do to provide more information to those having to manage that challenge is vital.
Thank you so much. Jas, you were nodding. Anything you'd like to add?
Yes, maybe slightly different take on this, right? So we talk about the nation-state sponsored stuff a lot in this sort of subject area, but I think we need to firstly consider that forecasting anything is tricky. If you look back 2022, the World Economic Forum met in Switzerland. They had all their projections and this and that, and then the global pandemic impact and Ukraine war and this and that. So nothing really that they said actually happened. So we have to take into account that when we are looking at the geopolitical aspects, okay, Russia may be slightly different, but China, we have to remember, is the manufacturing hub of the world, right? It is making more equipment than any other nation, possibly all other nations put together when it comes to this. So we can't legislate our way out of that, right? If we take example of Huawei, right? It might be slightly controversial, especially with the competent authorities sat here. Huawei and the whole 5G saga, I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but UK has asked to take Huawei equipment out of 5G, and now we have the worst 5G network across Europe, and it's potentially going to get even worse. So whether is China a real threat? Well, maybe some parts of China, maybe some agencies in China are, and maybe when we need to look at their entry into the critical national infrastructure slightly more detailed rather than going for a blanket knee-jerk reaction. That's my concern, that when we look at another example is Chinese wind turbine manufacturers. EU is trying to legislate its way out of that. So, and is that at some point, my worry is going to fall foul of the competition law, and then what? So it's a bit tricky one. But having said that, I think when we study what actually has happened, I've made a note of this. Has anybody heard of the Operation Cuckoo Bees? Right. So Operation Cuckoo Bees was run by, within quotation marks, state-sponsored operation that stole data from over 30 multinationals, reporting direct back to China. So that included the pharmaceutical industry, that included the manufacturing industry, transport, you name it. And so there was a lot of industrial espionage that's happening. So when you look at China, in our experience, a large majority, not all of it, is industrial espionage. It's not there to destroy or destabilize the infrastructure. It's more to do with what can we make and what can we get, maybe. Not 100% true. Yes, there are other aspects. So that's my point on it, that yes, it is a tricky one, but I don't think we should be legislating our way out of that. That won't work.
Great. Strong points here on China's role in our supply chains on the manufacturing side. I'd like to give Kyna the chance to respond to that. How far do you think the origin of the technology and supply chains matter for cybersecurity, and how do you also balance that need against the need for affordable energy?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. This is one of the biggest challenges we face, I think, and one of our top priorities is trying to get that balance right between security and innovation. We know we have to do a huge amount, or the energy sector is going to go through a huge amount of change over the next few years, and China is undoubtedly going to have a role in that. One thing the government is looking to do at the moment, or is currently doing, is a kind of China audit, so understanding in more depth our relationship with China, where we should be kind of competing, where there are impacts to our national security, where we should be collaborating and cooperating because there are net benefits. And I think net zero is one of those areas that falls slap bang in the middle. I think one thing that I would highlight here is that, there's also an element of what can we do to build in secure foundations to some of these systems, so that regardless of the components and where they're coming from, there is some actual kind of secure by design principles that underpin the system. And one area of that I'd highlight is the work we are doing on the smart energy system. So that work looks like bringing in a set of minimum standards for energy smart appliances that therefore set a baseline for cybersecurity and data privacy and grid stability, so that we can basically create that foundation for good practice in the UK. It's very difficult to influence the actual manufacturing when it's happening globally. What we can do is we can build in mechanisms that set standards for how these devices behave within the UK system. So I think that's something we can focus on, that's actor agnostic, and that can raise the resilience of the system and help with that issue. But yeah, it's a real challenge. And the only other thing I'd highlight is just NCSC, the National Cyber Security Centre, are putting out a lot of advice on how to choose components and systems that are well configured, how to choose your suppliers based on a set of kind of security principles. So it's tricky for industry to do that, but there is advice out there, and yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Before we're fully knee-deep into all the supply chain issues, I actually still wanted to ask one more question on the threat piece, because you can't really work in tech policy and live in London and avoid AI completely. So we're going to bring it into our panel discussion as well. And we're very thankful that Matthew here also works on AI policy, of course. How do you feel the introduction of AI adds to any additional risks the energy sector might be facing from cybersecurity actors?
Thank you. AI is the kind of hot topic of the moment, isn't it? Everyone's thinking about it, and you'll be pleased to hear Ofgem are thinking about it as well. So, first of all, we recognise it kind of increases the attack surface, right? It's another system, it's another tool that the energy sector are thinking about using. And Emil and I were talking in the break. We know AI can be vulnerable to attack. But the approach government's trying to take is to balance the kind of risks and opportunities when it comes to AI. So like any new system, we need to build on the kind of fundamentals and the principles that we've already got in place. Some of the work that collectively industry has done in terms of managing cyber risks could equally be applicable to managing AI risks. In terms of the government response, the Department for Energy is leading some thinking when it comes to the energy sector and the approach, setting that kind of ministerial risk appetite. The Department for Science, Innovation and Technology and the AI Safety Institute are leading a lot of strong work, thinking about some of the AI models and some of the bigger risks from AI. And as Ofgem, we are doing some work kind of really collaboratively with industry about what approach the energy sector should be taking. So we've done a consultation. We've set out some kind of initial principles, and later this year we're going to be publishing some AI guidance for the sector to try and support the sector in its thinking about how it can manage the risks, but also seize some of the opportunities. But Emil, maybe you want to come in on some of the more technical sides of AI that you and your colleagues are working on.
Yes, and sort of from a research perspective, so in my research group, we sort of started working on the vulnerability of AI mechanisms probably about 5-6 years ago. Now, if you go onto Google Scholar and type adversarial machine learning, you will find hundreds and hundreds of papers being published every year, if not thousands, documenting all sorts of vulnerabilities, new attacks, new defenses against AI models. We know that machine learning models are vulnerable. They are vulnerable to many different attacks. For example, perturbations applied to the input that would sort of seem insignificant or are not semantically meaningful lead to completely different outcomes. These systems require a lot of data in order to be trained on. If some of that data, or if somebody has the ability to sort of compromise some of that data, they can introduce within the sort of model biases and effects that will not always manifest, but will manifest in sort of certain circumstances chosen by the attacker. These are sort of often referred to as sort of poisoning attacks. And those type of attacks are very, very difficult to detect. So once such an effect has been essentially trained into the model, it's very difficult to detect that the model has been biased in that way. I would say the state of things is such that we know different types of attacks are possible, but we cannot even sort of enumerate or characterize all the possible attacks. We cannot characterize all the possible different types of perturbations, for example, that can be applied to an input in order to cause the system to give the completely wrong output. So I would urge people not to sort of underestimate the size of the challenge and of the vulnerability of these machine learning models. And from a sort of defenses point of view, we're not at the point where we can actually mitigate all of these attacks. But as Matthew has mentioned, the sort of, AI also brings a very large number of benefits. in terms of being able to optimize systems, customize systems, in terms of sort of building predictive models as to what will be needed in the future. So ultimately, it is a sort of a matter of trade-offs between the sort of the advantages and the risks. However, I would say if you are going to deploy an AI model as part of your system, you need to make sure that it is adversarially tested. So testing against, somebody who is deliberately trying to subvert it to the best of the sort of current state of the art in research. And also, I would urge that you evaluate what are the consequences if the decisions that your AI system is giving you are wrong. What are going to be the downstream, the sort of cascading consequences of that?
Thank you so much. You already mentioned some unknown risks that might appear with the increased use of AI systems, but we of course also know that already it's extremely challenging to manage any risk emerging from your supply chains, which is sort of the critical challenge for limiting cybersecurity incidents. How do you think this issue is addressed in the energy sector, and how do you think organizations can better manage their supply chain cyber risks? Jess, over to you.
Thank you, Pia. Thank you, Emil. That was quite enlightening, but can I add a tiny bit to that? It's both Google AI wars. In cyber world, we normally say that in future it'll be AI fighting AI, and you can be a mute spectator. But having said that, we will see AI. We are already seeing AI coming into our gas networks, our electricity distribution grid, so it's incredibly critical to take it seriously. Sorry.
If I can add, in research, we have certainly built AI tools to sort of compromise other AI tools. And so yes, that's definitely a possibility. And one of the reasons why we have built this is that is actually a way of systematic testing. We can train an AI system to sort of attack another AI system in different ways so that you can systematically test it and probe it for vulnerabilities.
I'm afraid we've gone down the AI rabbit hole. Let's bring it back to the security of supply chains.
Right. Sorry. It's a difficult one to get out, right? Supply chain, right. Supply chain. In the energy industry, are we managing it well? Now, within DNV, we work with clients globally across the spectrum. We work with OEMs, we work with asset owners, investors, and this and that. If my honest answer will be no, we're managing supply chain really badly at the moment. If we look at some of the reports now, Gartner, Sophos, DNV, we would normally say is that by end of next year, about half of the organizations in the energy sector would have suffered from a supply chain related cyber issue. By end of this decade, all of them, right? So it's not a question of if you will be attacked or if your supply chain will be compromised. It's a question of when will your supply chain be compromised and how prepared are you. And one beautiful thing about the NIST regulations, for example, is the focus that they put on disaster management, response and recovery. Unfortunately, in our experience, when it comes to supply chain, where organizations tend to be a bit short-sighted. So they're not looking beyond maybe their immediate suppliers. If you want an example, take a guess how many suppliers exist in the UK to onshore and offshore wind service industry, right? Last time I tried to count, you guys will have a better idea, I got up to 360 companies registered that supply products or services to wind farms. Now, as Kyna was saying, that if you're the bad guy, you only need to compromise it once. And that's the issue, that the supply chain is very intricate. I think I've actually stopped using the word supply chain, and I use the word supply web, because it is that. It's a web, and it's really difficult to answer this. So what can we do about it? As step one, get a good understanding. Follow, in our opinion, follow a good framework for your risk management, right? Whether you pick NCSC stuff, which is GAF, absolutely brilliant. But for third-party risk management, actually, NIST in the US have a guide which I absolutely love. Is really nice and implementable. So implement a good framework. Know your suppliers. Do the due diligence. That's very important. Just tell your procurement departments that yes, cheap is good, and we all want cheap, but maybe not in CNI. We need to look at other aspects. So vendor due diligence program, some sort of mechanism within the entire supply chain management that looks at, right, are these people we're getting stuff from, where is it actually coming from? Where's the transit, right? Who's shipping it? Who's looking at it? Right? So NVIDIA, right, last year before that, NVIDIA video cards, every single machine possibly has them. And they were in transit, and the truck was hijacked in Indonesia, was it? And then they went back into the supply chain, right? Now it's a real headache, because those were compromised with spyware, and nobody really knows where these thousands of video cards are that are gathering data. They could be in a CNI site, who knows, right? So that's understanding your supply chain. And then another simple thing is build the trust with your suppliers. Speak to them, right? Understand what their issues are, what they are, might issues they might be facing themselves, right? But not with a view of, pat on the back kind of thing. What I say is, if somebody is very vulnerable, diversify. Don't rely, where you can, diversify. Don't rely on a single supplier if you can. It's not always easy. Very last point on this maybe is identify your critical assets. So you might have hundreds of computers, several servers running. Not all servers are made equal, right? Identify the ones that matter, right? And make sure you have backups for them, right? Because lead times on some of these devices, if you look for a firewall, I think it's about 8 months to 12 months at the moment for some of the industrial firewalls. So if you burn one out today and you rely on that, you can't keep the plant shut down for a year. You'll be out of business. So spare management.
I've heard some rare praise for policy and regulation in your comments there. I think that's a good opportunity to pass on to Matthew. How do you think regulation is addressing things like supply chain risks? We know that more and more countries are legislating on this topic, imposing mandatory cybersecurity standards on critical national infrastructure. But at the same time, we also often hear that more regulation stands sort of in contrast to innovation and stifles innovation. How do you ensure that you design effective regulation that doesn't limit innovation in the energy sector?
Thank you, Pia. And yeah, Jazz, some really good advice for organisations there. Just first on the supply chain. When we're talking to industry, the supply chain covers such a breadth of different types of organisations. It's a significant challenge for them. There is a lot of good practice out there, so we are seeing organisations do some really good things, but they are finding it difficult sometimes because of the nature of certainly some of the international and bigger suppliers. We as the kind of regulator are putting requirements on organisations within the UK energy sector, but sometimes they're finding it difficult to make sure that the companies that are supplying them are following the right kind of standards and levels that they need as well. So that's something that kind of the regulator and government definitely recognise, and we're kind of working with industry to see what we can do as kind of government and the regulator to try and influence the supply chain. So, how can we, ensure that secure by design approach? Just coming onto the kind of regulation and innovation kind of point, I would definitely challenge the view about whether it's a kind of either or. We definitely need both. How is Ofgem approaching that, and how is the UK thinking about this? We're taking an outcomes-based approach, which I think is really important. It's not a tick box. We don't just say to companies, if you meet all these things and you can put a tick in the box, then you're fine. Because we know from elsewhere, in other sectors, in other countries, that just doesn't work, and it becomes a real kind of compliance-focused effort for industry rather than thinking through their own risks and applying the principles. And that kind of outcomes-based approach enables flexibility for organisations to think about their challenges and how they want to approach it, and it enables innovation, which is really important. Within Ofgem, we're a big champion of innovation in the cyber area. We know it's really critical. We can't keep doing the same things and expect different results. So how do we do that? So through our cyber investment, so we enable kind of network companies funding around cyber, and part of the formula for that is about innovation. They have to demonstrate to us how they're being innovative if they want the funding. We also support the UK government's Strategic Innovation Fund when it comes to cybersecurity and AI in the energy sector. Kind of really trying to champion proposals from the energy sector. And then thirdly, we work really closely with kind of communities in the UK that drive research and development. So for example, we were supporting a conference recently where Emil came and spoke, and lots of other kind of academic colleagues, both from the UK and internationally, are kind of brought together, sharing their ideas and their research with industry. So how can we as the regulator with our government colleagues bring together the challenges that industry have, bring together the people who are doing the research and try and convene those and try and make sure that we've got that knowledge sharing in place. So acting as a kind of champion on innovation there is a really key thing for Ofgem.
Great, thank you so much. Really good to hear what you're doing in terms of innovation and research and development, I think. Just before we move on to audience questions, I think it would be great to hear a little bit more about what the future looks like and what sort of we'll be doing when we're looking ahead, and particularly at the net zero transition. What does net zero mean for cybersecurity in the energy sector? What does the grid of the future look like, and how cyber resilient, to adopt Jazz language here, will it be? Kyna, do you want to go first, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pia. So I think we've already touched on it a few times during the discussion, but we all know now that the energy system is moving from these kind of old, larger bits of infrastructure and that unidirectional flow of electricity from generation into the rest of the system. And instead, it's becoming much more bidirectional. So we're going to see increasing roles for what we're calling prosumers, who get to choose when to charge their EV, who get to choose when to turn their dishwasher on based on when energy is cheap. And so we've covered this. It's about that increasing attack surface and trying then to build insecurity into all of those different aspects and elements of the system is a much more complex situation that we find ourselves in. Lay that on top of things becoming, everything becoming internet connected, and then how that interacts with kind of legacy kit is a real challenge. I think one thing I would highlight as a real step change in how we're able to identify and manage these risks is, you may have seen in the news, on the 1st of October, there will be a new national energy system operator, which is essentially an independent, publicly funded organisation which will combine the electricity system operator and the gas system operator. And that will enable us to get much better technical insight into the system and how it's changing, and those interdependencies between different parts of the system as it changes. So that will be huge for us in government in getting that technical analysis and insight into the system, and how we then might build in better policy interventions, better mitigations to help manage the transition.
Sounds like there's some key developments coming up in the next 6 to 12 months. Emil, anything you want to add on sort of more the technical change that we will face with net zero transition?
Yes, I mean, I tend to think of systems in a sense from the sort of their emerging properties and their sort of systemic properties point of view. I think in part through the application of AI and so on, we're going to see a drive for more optimization of the systems in order to be able to reduce consumption and so on. And one thing that we need to bear in mind is that there is a sort of tension between optimization and resilience. Resilience intrinsically relies on sort of having an overcapacity. And in particular, if we want to be resilient to sort of malicious interference with the systems, then this needs to be planned accordingly. Again, this is sort of, it's an aspect of trade-off, but a trade-off that sort of needs to be formalized and analyzed and sort of documented. The other thing is, I think it was mentioned earlier on, this sort of hyperconnectivity. We are increasing the number of interconnections and interdependencies. And this means that effectively effects are going to be much more difficult to analyze and much more difficult. So I think we need to be able to design the sort of the techniques and the tools that would enable us to be able to understand how a sort of compromises of the system may impact their operation. And this is also necessary in order to be able to develop strategies for how we actually respond to them. So optimization, interconnection and interdependencies, and the third, I think, important point, which we've discussed to some extent, is this aspect of having, more devices, more systems that are coming onto the system.
Excellent. Very, very thankful for any sort of technical input on our panel today. I'd like to pass it over to the audience. If there are any questions in the room, either for Team Cyber or Team Energy, please feel free to raise your hand. Gentleman over here in the aisle. Please, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, Alan Leung, Macquarie Group. A question for the panel. With the UK cybersecurity and resilience bill being put forth in this parliament, what are your expectations about how that would change kind of how CNI is governed, how resilience is governed in the industry? I think there's a recent directive that data centers are now going to be in scope as well. So back to your kind of AI theme around that. And also, if we take that as one data point, and that there's going to be up to about half a dozen new interconnectors between the British Isles and the continent between now and 2030, then regulatory alignment between what we're doing here in the UK with Europe is really important. And I think there's a view that we're playing a bit of catch up in the regulatory space. So keen to hear what your views are in terms of the policy direction, what it means for the energy industry, kind of a supply chain, and where do you think maybe some other gaps are on the UK side on a policy that you feel like you need to see to really kind of, on that side of energy security that needs to be patched up?
Matthew, I think maybe one for you to take.
Good question. So, as some of you may be aware, as part of the King's speech earlier this year, government announced the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, which has been kind of long awaited, and it's going to provide an update to the kind of really key cyber legislation that the UK has, which is the Network and Information Systems legislation. That legislation was driven from Europe, and pre-Brexit, we kind of incorporated it onto our books. But as the kind of questioner alluded to, the EU has kind of done an updated iteration, and they've developed what they're calling NIS2. So I guess our cybersecurity and resilience bill is going to be the UK iteration of what NIS2 will look like. From our perspective, we think it brings a lot of opportunities for the energy sector in particular. The thresholds that have been set and the kind of number of operators is only limited currently. Limited to those most critical organizations. We definitely see, as the sector is transforming and evolving, we as government and the regulator need to be kind of have the right tools to support those sectors and to drive change and to make sure that cyber security, cyber resilience is kind of front and center for them. So I think for us, it's a real opportunity, and we're going to be working quite closely with the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, who are the kind of lead sponsors of the bill, to try and shape that and make sure that that works for the energy sector. You mentioned kind of interconnectors and data centers. I think those are, some really kind of key parts of the sector, but we're thinking about all the new low carbon technology that's going to be kind of coming onto the grid. And there's a whole range of subsectors of the energy system currently that fall outside of that legislation. So as a potential tool for driving change and increasing resilience in the sector, it's a real opportunity, we think.
Any other reflections from the panel on the bill?
Just that, as Matthew said, it's such a huge opportunity. I think it's obviously a real challenge making sure regulation can keep up with the rapid change in the system. So this will be, the first time since the regulations came into force in 2018 that we'll be able to adapt them. One thing we are looking to bring into the energy sector in particular is bringing organisations remotely controlling load into scope. So that is, those of you who are familiar with energy, that's your aggregators, that is organisations who work on behalf of suppliers to bring electricity on and off the grid in response to changes in energy prices, for example. So we'll be looking to develop a whole new category in the regulations for those type of operators. Again, I would also say outside of the regulatory landscape, that's another area where the National Energy System Operator will help us in identifying how criticality is changing in the system. What types of organisation do we now need to look at in a different light because they're playing an increasing role in the system. So particularly thinking around, you mentioned interconnectors, but also the rapidly changing offshore wind picture, organisations who own the offshore wind transmission infrastructure, they are all very much now on our radar, and we're interested in kind of exploring how to build resilience in those sectors which have previously been so small that they've been slightly off the radar. So definitely a time to pivot our understanding of what's critical and where we need to target particular energy effort.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions from the audience, please? Maybe we can take one or two. Yes, please, here and there.
Thank you. Stephen Hermanson from National Gas. Thank you for the panel. Really interesting discussion. My question is going to draw on a theme that emerged in the first panel about bifurcation of technology systems. And I was just interested in what the panel thinks about bifurcation of security norms and how we could then reconcile our differences, potentially differences, with extended supply chains globally. So how would that work? Because if we recognize that we need to work with international industries and partners around the world, do we feel that we can overcome the challenge of reconciling our differences in norms? And I refer to mechanisms like the UN Cybercrime Convention and rules of cyber norms being debated at that level. Because ultimately this will start to flow down into the norms, then the standards, and then the legislative frameworks that we are going to rely on in order to conduct our business. Just interested in views on the panel about how that would work.
Great question. And the gentleman 2 rows behind you, or 1 row?
Hi, thank you. I'm Samuel Cowlard with Orpheus Cyber. I'm a CTA analyst. I have a question for the panel. We see increasing connections between nation-state actors and hacktivists, as well as ransomware, and we know that these actors do target energy infrastructure. And traditionally they have specific and to some extent limited capability. Do we see proliferation of more sophisticated TTPs as these actors align with nation states? And if so, what are we doing to actually increase the resilience in these CNI entities? Thank you.
Great. So one question on norms and global standards and one on methods of threat actors, non-state actors and hacktivists. Who wants to go first? Shall we start with the norms question?
I can kick off. Perhaps others can come in. I mean, taking the supply chain example in particular, I think it's a really good question. I mean, obviously, lots of the suppliers to the energy sector that are critical are global companies. They supply all over the world, and they know they're critical. So actually having influence over these companies and what they do for security is quite difficult. That's where I think, and something we're starting to do more, is speaking to big international partners like the US to try and first off develop a common language for how we talk about supply chains, how we basically understand the links between different standards and different baseline minimum kind of norms and standards in different countries, to start building up a picture of where we can have a concerted effort on this stuff and where we can use our relationships with other countries to influence these suppliers and these organizations into what we require of them. I think it's tricky because every country has a slightly different approach, and it's tricky for suppliers as well to understand what's needed for them or to repeat slightly different requirements depending on different operators. So the more we can do to consolidate that and kind of get a more common approach on what we need from these organizations, the better. And we definitely haven't got there yet, but we are hopefully moving in the right direction on that and starting to engage more with international partners, I think.
Thank you. And on the second question, Jazz, is that one that you'd like to take?
Sure, I can take that if you remind me what the question was. No, it's okay. That is a really brilliant question, the link between the hacktivists and the nation states. Now, have you heard of RAS, RAAS, ransomware as a service, right? Yeah, so, that's where we are. Ransomware as a service is a real market. You can go, you can purchase that. You don't need the expertise you needed a few years ago, to be able to code. So that typical visualization that they show in movies, that hacker hood down, green screen, that's not the reality. Now, a lot of these folks, right, that they get sponsored, they get resources, they get funding, and they get training to carry out whatever they're doing. And sometimes maybe the political milestone that a nation state needs and what these guys are looking for, maybe there's a connection somewhere, and that usually determines who they will support. But the thing that, bringing back Emil's AI into that again, within the RAS now, it's almost off-the-shelf products you can get that, look, I want to attack the financial institution or I want to attack the NHS, right? This is the mixture I'll need. So you can pretty much get that mixture, implement that. Now, these things are really expensive, so a normal group won't get the resources for that. So our understanding is, our research really shows that that's where really nation states come in. That's where the funding comes from. So expect a sharp increase in that trend as the geopolitical situation gets a bit more thorny.
Very interesting points. We had two more questions here in the front.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting panel. Michal Meydan, Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, so Team Energy, I guess. Question on China. What is the China threat? Is it components that come from China, be they in solar and wind turbines, in batteries? Is it the software that comes from China, or is it that systems are interconnected and therefore vulnerable to state-linked or state-sponsored hacking, including by China?
Thanks. Dan Marks from RUSI. Emil talked quite a lot about the expanding threat surface and all the interconnected devices and decentralization. I was wondering, are these risks going to be mostly mitigated by design or by monitoring and reactive kind of processes? And if it is kind of by design, or where it is by design, is there the potential for it to impact the design of the energy system itself? So beyond cyber, but to say, okay, we might limit the extent to which things are automated, or it might start to impact that, or even things like, you have the AI trading now for batteries because they're arbitraging across 3 different markets. So the battery system is controlled largely by AI as products coming out in Germany, for example. But you might say, okay, we need to limit that to an extent. How far do you see it going? How much do you see it kind of in the design of the systems themselves?
Perhaps we take the proactive versus reactive approach question first, and that gives all panelists an opportunity to play rock, paper, scissors. Who has to take the China question?
Okay, I'll start. I think it's both. Yeah. I think that, and currently the sort of, the government emphasizes quite a lot a secure by design approach. And I think this is absolutely right in the sense that we need to think at the core of all the elements that we put into the system, how to make them more secure and more trustworthy and so on. However, I also think that this will require, that we will also require a capability, because invariably, no matter how much you try to make them secure by design, vulnerabilities are going to creep in. And incidentally, one of the problems with the supply chains is that if you have a lot of components, regardless of where they're coming from, that share the same vulnerability, then that means that they can be compromised in the same way by whichever malicious actor. So that is not going to eliminate completely the sort of the risk to the system. And we also need to have an approach where we have the tools and the sophistication and the methods to be able to dynamically adapt to the systems in response to a compromise in order to be able to ensure that we minimize the impact that an attack can have of the system, and that we minimize the overall disruption of the system. And I think within the context of energy system, minimizing the disruption is sort of particularly important. Jas mentioned earlier the sort of the distinction between sort of security and resilience. I sometimes tend to speak of things as secure by design and resilient by adaptation. But that's kind of the way I see it, and I think a combination of both is necessary.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, a volunteer for the China question.
I can go, but it will be probably an unsatisfactory answer, at least at this classification. I hope you can understand. I think the way we need to think about China, firstly, is that they are different because of how integrated into our economy they are. And that's what we were speaking about earlier when we were talking about finding different areas to compete, collaborate, and engage with them. We have to treat them in a different way to how we treat other threat actors, for example, Russia. They behave in a very different way. We are very much inextricably linked in many areas. I think what we have seen in recent events, again, is that growing sophistication and growing intent to gather data and gather information about the functioning of foreign governments, of critical infrastructure abroad. So we've seen a real change in that, and their willingness to take slightly more extreme measures to do so, like the living off the land techniques we saw early in the year. I think, obviously, There is a challenge around components, which we've already touched on as well, in that critical parts of the supply chain, thinking of solar and inverters and components like that, are very dominated by Chinese manufacturing. So again, I think, you know, it boils down to kind of that defense in depth approach that you were just talking about, making sure that we have enough contingency in the system to deal with those kinds of risks. I'm not saying necessarily we are in the perfect place there, but as we continue to build our understanding of how China is behaving and paying real attention to the changes in threat behavior, I think that's going to help us in navigating that challenge.
Try cornering her over lunch.
I don't know if anyone else has any other views or anything to add.
From a industrial background, industry perspective, right? I'll be very straightforward. If China decides to cause harm, there's not a country in the world that can safeguard itself against a cyber threat coming from China. So it's not about, to me, the components or software or things like that. It's whatever they choose to and what we're importing. So if you look at our energy infrastructure, the proliferation of battery storage sites, if I take them for example, right? Most of them remotely controlled, SCADA systems, most of them will talk to data centers outside of the UK, right? How are we going to control that? You know, so if we, again, look at China as just a threat, I don't think that approach, one, is sensible, fair, and also the reaction that we will have might be driven by hypersensitivity to politics rather than technology. So what we need to do is just go back to basics on that and forget where a component is coming from, which part of the world, apply the same rule set, which is it's going into a critical system. The country relies on that system being operational. It needs to meet these criteria, right? And as long as it meets those things, you know, security by design being one of them, you know, I'm a big fan of zero trust architecture being implemented. So if it meets that, great, it can go in. If it doesn't meet that, it doesn't matter who made it, whether it's China or whether it's India, whether it's the United States or Chile, doesn't matter. Then it stays out of my CNI infrastructure. So that's the way I think we, especially in DNV being maritime, right, a lot of maritime heritage, we can't afford to move away from, you know, there won't be a ship in the world if we said we won't use Chinese components. So that's slightly different take from.
Thank you. Great to have both perspectives. Any further questions from the audience to our panel? Yes, please, and gentleman in the back.
Hi there, John Gilbert, National Grid. The UK energy sector is very complex. There's multiple stakeholders with different levels of security, maturity, especially around cybersecurity. What thing do you think we could do better to improve information and intelligence sharing, whether it be between stakeholders or between organisations like the NCSC?
I'm happy to start, but then others might also have a view, particularly thinking from Ofgem's perspective. I think the cultural point is huge here. So how can we make sure we have a culture of sharing best practice and actually sharing when things go wrong? I think we have a really good kind of trusted relationship network within our critical infrastructure operators, particularly in the gas and electricity sectors. And I think that has huge benefit for having a more open conversation about cyber and about security, which I think can go a long way. I think the challenge, obviously, as you've highlighted, is expanding that out to enough people, getting people involved in the kind of really interesting and useful discussions that are happening within those forums. I definitely think government has a role in expanding that information out as much as possible, and we are looking to set up kind of wider groups with smaller organisations, particularly from growing renewable sectors too. I think also the NCSC, the National Cyber Security Centre, has a huge role in getting out information in a timely way and as we said before, making it kind of tangible and actionable, that even smaller organizations with less cyber maturity can take these guidance notes or resources and implement them in their organizations. Again, as well, it's about making sure our regulatory regime captures the organizations that are going to play a critical role, like your aggregators and load controllers and other smaller businesses who are less kind of operational technology focused and more IT focused. But I do think because we are unfortunately seeing more incidents and more sophistication in the incidents we're seeing, I think there's a much more public dialogue about cyber, and even just the prevalence of cyber resilience bill in the King's speech, and just the prominence of the discussion, I think is a sign of how things are changing and hopefully how we can expand out information to lesser contacted organisations, I suppose. But I don't know if others have a view.
Thank you. It's absolutely the right question to be asking. Cyber is a team game, a team sport, and we need to play nicely together. I think what we are seeing is that the big players in the energy sector are playing well. They are sharing information. We've got kind of quite well-established information sharing kind of groups and communities, and that's great. But as the sector evolves, I think that level of engagement and communication needs to kind of raise up. And I think there are real benefits for industry leading the way in a number of these areas. So, not only can kind of big players like National Grid support, other kind of parts of the sector, but that also has a kind of knock-on benefit in that a number of those smaller organizations are likely to be part of your supply chain and part of your kind of existing ecosystem. So I think we're in a really good place on cyber security as a sector, and this is true in multiple industry sectors, in that cybersecurity professionals come together and talk and share information and experience and best practice with each other, even though the companies that they might work for are fierce rivals, because we all recognise, that those professionals recognise that they're facing exactly the same challenges, no matter kind of which organisation in that sector they're working on. So I think more of that kind of positive collaboration is right, but I think there's a big role for industry to play in kind of leading the way there.
Thank you. Further round of questions from the audience. Yeah, maybe in the back.
Thank you. My name is Rihanna King. I'm a cyber threat intelligence specialist with BP. I've heard a lot of talk today about Chinese state-sponsored actors, and while that might be the most likely threat, I've seen obviously all the discussion around Volt Typhoon. The most dangerous scenario from my perspective is disruptive attack by a state-aligned or even a state-directed hacktivist or fictivist group, for example. I'm thinking of Zarya getting access to a Canadian oil pipeline, Cyber Avengers hacking Unitronics PLCs. Both of those, they didn't require a high capability from the attackers. It was internet-exposed devices with purely secured accounts. Are we at risk of focusing on the wrong thing and looking at these sophisticated attacks and how we defend against them, when really we need to be getting back to the basics and getting people to have mandated MFA to not have devices internet-exposed?
Great challenge from the audience about focusing on the wrong things. And yeah, one more question here in the front from Dan.
Hi, sorry. Another question. It's in response a little bit to something Jazz said about not worrying about where components come from. Speaking to OEMs, or an OEM earlier this year, they kind of pointed out that should an operator or leave a project, they would really struggle to take over the operation of that kind of plant or asset, given the reliance on software updates. So they said there was no way they'd be able to replicate updates from the original supplier, which presumably means that you are dependent on that supplier, even should they leave, or your system's just going to go out of date, or you have to somehow find a way of mitigating that. So I just wanted to ask how that kind of squares with not worrying about where the system comes from, the software comes from, the components come from.
Great, 2 challenging questions from the audience. You're really deserving your lunch afterwards.